All right, if I could have your attention, we have a awesome conference. I'll say a few words in a minute, but first I want to introduce Cristelia Garcia, a professor here who is an extraordinary asset to Silicon Flatirons and Colorado law. This conference has been her mastermind, and she's got a great group of folks here, and let me turn it over to her.
Thanks, guys. Hi, welcome to Colorado Law and to Silicon Flatiron's second annual content conference. I'm really appreciative of the support from people who flew in from all over the place, and for students who showed up as well. Whether this is your first Silicon Flatirons event or your 14th, I think you're in for a treat. For those who are joining us also via live stream, welcome. We hope that everyone, both here in our real-world audience and our virtual audience, will join in the conversation. On Twitter, please use the hashtag Flatirons, and we'll be following along. There's a lot of work that goes into putting something like this together, and so a lot of people to thank, and I'll try to be really brief so we can get to the good stuff. The lion's share of all the logistical work putting this together falls to Anna, and Jamie and Cactus and their team, without whom none of us would know where to go or when, and we'd be hungry and thirsty and probably still at the airport. So thank you very much to their team for hurting us. I'd also like to thank Dean Weiser and the entire Silicon Flatirons organization for their incredibly generous support of me personally and my efforts to bring some content flavor to the center's programming. And of course, I'd like to thank our amazing group of panelists, presenters, and moderators for taking the time out to be here today. Finally, I'd like to thank all the students in attendance, both those who were made to come and those who are here of their own volition or both. I appreciate the enthusiasm. I appreciate especially those who offered rides to our various participants. Also, thank you to the Silicon Flatiron Student Group and the Intellectual Property Association who along with the Copyright Society of the U.S., sponsored a Copyright Careers panel over lunch that gave us a chance to hear a little bit more about some of our panelists' career paths. Thank you to Jordan Barnett for taking the lead on coordination, Katie Schwab for helping to put all that together, and of course to Lauren, Neil, John, Kimberly, and Jason for graciously taking the time to speak to our students. We've got an incredible group of industry leaders, academics, and artists here today to discuss innovation through the lens of incentives. To some extent, all three branches of intellectual property, patent, copyright, and trademark aim in one way or another to incentivize and protect creation. This is no small aspiration, of course, and I think it's safe to say that to date the results have been mixed. As I drive home ad nauseum to my poor copyright students, this challenge owes in large part to the various and widely varying constituents which IP attempts to serve. And perhaps no other area of the law is the saying you can't please everyone all of the time more true than it is an IP policy. Well, we could also probably modify this to say you can't please anyone ever. And so today's panels at times will undoubtedly highlight this divergence, right? We'll start with a presentation by Professor Lemley, who joins us from Stanford to kick us off with some data on how various content industries have fared in the age of the internet and to discuss a bit about what the implications of that data might be, followed by a discussion among industry leaders from really different worlds, right? We've got a global media firm, small academic publishing company, innovative cable providers, and then we'll move to the artist panel. Professor Sibley will kick it off with a presentation stemming from data in her recent book, The Eureka Myth, in which she conducted interviews with creators of all stripes to produce one of the first qualitative accounts of creativity in the field, followed by a discussion with an award-winning photographer, an incredibly creative and accomplished musician who also heads a creators group, and a computer science professor, fantasy author, and defender of all things transformative. I want to thank Justin Conrad, who's an entertainment attorney at Hutchinson, Black & Cook here in Boulder, for bravely taking the helm there. And finally, we'll turn to the policy folks. We've got today a member of Congress, senior counsel for the Copyright Office, head of government affairs, one of entertainment's most powerful trade organizations, and counsel for one of the country's largest public interest organizations, each of whom has dedicated their career to finding commonalities among the differences, which is what we're really going to be looking for here today, and whose discussion, I hope, will synthesize some of the contemporary thinking and outlining thoughts for continued improvement in copyright policy. We're especially fortunate to have Professor Held moderating that panel, and he'll start with a discussion of his work on the use of photos on Wikipedia and the problem that the page builders face when they're discerning the legal status of those photos. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to our dean, fearless leader, moderator of the first panel, and founder of Silicon Flatirons, Phil Weiser.
So universities, like the content industries, have been facing lots of interesting challenges and existential questions about what make them special and what their futures look like. From my lens at Silicon Flatirons, I am very bullish on the powerful role of universities, on law schools, and on the ability to bring together people across academia, industry, government, and have intellectually honest and rigorous conversations. I mentioned before how pleased we are to have Crystalia aboard. She gets that on a very deep level, has a very diverse background herself, and this conference in powerful ways reflects what Silicon Flatirons is about, what Colorado Law is about, and what Crystalia is about. We're really thrilled to have some alums engaged, and so let me just mention a few of them because they're really great points of pride. So Justin Conrad is now doing entertainment law here in town, Hutchinson, Black, and Cook, and they're, again, second year in a row, sponsoring the reception and helping to support this conference. We really appreciate Justin's success and leadership. On the panel with me, Matt Bond, who's Executive Vice President at NBC Universal and has been doing fabulous things there and is really loyal here to Colorado Law, where he's even set up a scholarship for a Matt Bond Scholar, and has every year, this year for I think the 4th or 5th year in a row, is hiring an intern with him in New York. We're thrilled to have him as part of this family. We also have John Bergmeyer, who's been noted, is a grad from this program who's now public knowledge. And in one moment, Preston was there in DC. We had a panel of 3 people, and 2 out of 3 were Colorado Law alums. I mentioned Preston, who's been involved with Silicon Flatirons for quite some time, and also because one of the highlights of Silicon Flatirons was a panel on a topic related to what we're about to talk about that culminated with a hug between Mark Lemley and Preston. Hard to beat that as things go. Also on this panel, Lauren Wallace, who is, I think, now in her first Silicon Flatirons appearance. It's great to have you here. She's at an exciting Colorado startup, Layer 3 TV, we'll hear a little about. And Lynn Reiner, who is an entrepreneur, a publisher, and is newly joining this conversation. We're thrilled to have you here, Lynn, as well. As Crystalia advertised, the idea is to give an academic who's thought about this a chance to reflect a little bit and then get a discussion going with the panelists. To that end, in someone who is really a truly deeply special academic, has been a great friend to us here, has come many times here, Mark Lemley. Let me give you the floor.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming. 6 years ago in this room, in the height of internet panic mode among the content industries, I gave a talk here called Is the Sky Falling on the Content Industries? In which I said, you know what? Hard to tell, maybe too soon to tell whether or not the internet is going to kill off everything. But here's a list of every new technology in the last 125 years. And look, in every one of those cases, the content owners told you the sky was going to fall, we're going to go out of business, nothing will survive. And maybe that turns out to be true of the internet as well. This wasn't a popular message to be heard by the entertainment folks in particular. In 2010, this was the run-up to SOPA PIPA, right, where internet is such an existential threat to the content industries that we've got to basically break the internet in order to prevent it from breaking us. So what I thought I would do is to come back 6 years later and check in, right, and see whether the sky is in fact falling. So I'm going to just sort of give you some data from a variety of industries on sort of what's happened in the last several years, and then hopefully we can start to have a conversation about what happens in new business models around internet space. So let's start with music. The music numbers don't look so great from the music industry perspective, particularly in this chart. Worth noting, by the way, whoops, that was bad. That's not, it turns out, a pointer. Worth noting, by the way, that this is a long view chart, right? It goes back to 1950. So you see kind of increases in the 60s, and then you see a big spike in the 1970s. That's when the music industry persuaded everyone who owned records to buy cassettes instead, right? And then it tapered off for a while in the 1980s. And then you see a big spike running from the late 80s through the end of the 1990s. That's when the music industry persuaded everyone who had bought cassettes to replace the records they bought to buy CDs to replace the cassettes replace the records they bought. And then, wham, there comes the internet 2000. And things look grim, right? And if you measure it from that height, from that time in 1999, it sure looks like we've got a pretty long decline. Now, I think that's absolutely right. The record companies are making substantially less revenue now than they were. That seems to have flattened off in the last several years, but it's flattened off at about a third of what it was at the height back in 1999, and numbers that go back, you got to go back 40 or 50 years to find that number. So that's not terribly encouraging. When you map that against the growth of file sharing in North America, well, it looks like we got a pretty clear story here. Hey, what's going on? People aren't buying music anymore. People are instead stealing music, and the music industry is in trouble as a result. Things are a bit more complicated than that, though. So one way we get at the complication is we look at the difference between the changes in revenue over time and the changes in music transactions over time. So on the right is the revenue curve, which looks like the one we just saw. Big spike up to 1999, big decline. We can see that the purples, the downloaded albums and downloaded singles, are making up an increasing percentage of the music industry's revenue. Probably half at this point, but still that number is well less than it was at the height. But then look at the left side of the graph. Right? The left side of the graph represents actual transactions, purchase transactions. None of this includes Spotify and music streaming, and we'll get to that in a moment. Purchase transactions are higher in the music industry than they have ever been before in history, and by a good long margin. Well, how can that be? Right? What is it? First off, interesting that there's more and more file sharing than ever before, but there's also more and more purchasing of music than ever before. The big transitional difference is that people don't buy digital albums. They buy individual songs. So that a music transaction, which was mostly circa the 1970s and 1980s, here's a bundle of songs that you might like some or all of together for $16.99, has been replaced with a whole bunch of individual transactions for 99 cents or $1.29 on the iTunes store that mean that people are buying music, that they're buying more music than ever before by some measures, but that they're not spending as much money to do it. At the same time that the music industry has been losing money, however, the music world has been benefiting from an unprecedented growth in creativity. So these are the albums released, and as you can see, we had a kind of fairly steady flow of albums released in the 1990s, hovering around 30,000 albums a year. And then the internet did a rather remarkable thing. It coincided with a huge spike in the number of albums released, right? Peaking at over 100,000 albums a year, right? More than a threefold increase. That drops a bit with the recession in 2009, but it seems then to level off, and to level off at a level that is 2.5 times what it was at the height of the record industry. Now, I think there are a bunch of factors that go into that, but one of the factors that goes into that is simply that it is much easier today to make and release an album than it ever has been in history. Right? If you wanted to release a record album in 1982, the way to do it was to find somebody in one of the 4 major record labels, get them to agree that you were a good artist, go in, record the music, have them press it, have them generate copies, have them put their copies in a truck, have those trucks drive to music stores, and have a bunch of retail people sell those discs to customers, right? Now, if you've got a couple of $1,000s, you can afford high professional quality record equipment, and it is trivial to release your album to the world. Whether anyone will find it turns out to be a different issue, but even then, I think the results are quite interesting. So these are unique songs on the Hot 100 chart, and so one of the things that this measures is not just diversity of music that is produced, but diversity of music that is actually consumed, that's listened to. And what we see is a long-term decline from 1965 to 2000. Right? Consistent with the idea that we're concentrating the music business, right? How many songs made it to the top 100? By the end of the 1990s, in any given year, it was only 300 songs, right? So we had a lot of staying power. A few songs were dominating the charts. That starts to turn around with the internet. So more people actually are buying in bulk. We're buying in bulk a wider array of songs than we were before the internet, and that's some suggestion, I think, that we're not just producing a bunch of new music that no one listens to, but that we're actually expanding somewhat the music that we do listen to. We're also expanding the music we listen to in another dimension. This is Spotify data. When I grew up, which admittedly was a long time ago, if you wanted music, right, the way you got music was you went to your record store, and the record store probably carried about 300 albums. 200 of which were current music, and then, you know, there's some kind of classics, right? You could always get a hold of some Beatles album or some Led Zeppelin album, but most of the stuff you would find in the record store was stuff that had been released in the last year or two. One of the things the internet has done is it has opened up the time parameters for musical consumption. And so people who consume music today may consume music produced in 2015 and music produced in 1965 with equal likelihood. And one of the things this shows is that for people who download their music on Spotify, yeah, there is a kind of recency trend, right? This is, after all, Spotify is, after all, something that is very generationally driven. There aren't a lot of 75-year-old people who are getting their music on Spotify. But even among the generally young people who are using Spotify, they're listening to a bunch of music from the last 10 or 15 years, but they're also listening to a bunch of music from the 1960s, from the 1970s, from the 1980s. And music that would have disappeared in a prior era is still getting played again. The other thing that's worth noting here is just the total number of counts here, right? So these are play counts by year in which the song was released, right? Songs released in late 2000s are getting something like 800 million plays on Spotify in a given year. Total that across 50 years, right? And you've got what, you know, 20, 30, 40 billion plays on Spotify for money, in addition to the money that's being spent to purchase the music in the data we saw before. And these next two graphs, I think, are really interesting. So these are the percentage of unique songs that are released in the world by new artists. And here we see, you know what, new artists were accounting for more and more music right up until the internet boom, and then that number starts to drop. Well, that doesn't sound good. We want new artists. We want to encourage them. It turns out, though, that that's driven not by a lack of released songs by new artists. In fact, we have more new artist music than ever before. It's driven by a boom in the songs produced by existing artists. So after a long-term 40-year decline in the number of songs produced by existing artists start churning out a bunch of new music in the 2000s. Glenn Lunny at Texas A&M has a study in which he tries to sort of explain the effect of this, and his explanation is actually the fact that the music industry was making less money drove existing artists to go out and make more stuff. When you're rich, you substitute leisure, right, for extra money, because you don't need the extra money. And that one of the interesting byproducts of the fact that the record industry got less money is we actually got more albums by existing artists in the internet era than we would otherwise have predicted. All right, that's music. Not such a great story, I think, if you're a record company, right? The revenues are down, but it's worth noting, right, that transactions, both of the streaming and the internet side, are up substantially, and that's hopefully at least an encouraging path. Newspapers, I can't tell you, are particularly encouraging, right? If your business is selling print advertisements in print newspapers to people who will then have that newspaper delivered on the street corner to individuals, that's not a long-term growth business, right? And the internet has certainly demonstrated that. We've lost more than half of the revenue in newspaper advertising in the last 10 years, and I don't think there's any reason to think that's going to turn around. But it doesn't follow from that news is going away. In fact, the news, or even that news revenue is going away. In fact, look to another source of news, television news, and you see exactly the opposite trend. Fox News is doing extremely well. Some of you might view that as another harbinger of the end of days. But if you feel that way, well, you should at least be somewhat comforted that CNN and MSNBC are doing pretty darn well too, right? And this is not viewership. This is not, how many hours are they on the air or who's up there. This is revenue for news outlets. So the story that, hey, news is dying because of the internet, if you look at it as a print newspaper question, turns out to be absolutely true. Right? But if you look at it beyond that, even in television, cable television, the opposite seems to be true. And I think that's even more true for the profusion of online news sources that we're now seeing, the Huffington Posts of the world, the Slates, and so forth. Movies. One interesting thing that happened with movies is, with respect to the internet, is essentially nothing. Right? A lot of people stream movies illegally. A lot of people file share movies, no question about it. If you look at the revenue curve, which is the red line, you barely see any movement associated with the existence of the internet. We've kind of had a nice, slow, steady, long-term increase. There were some wobbles, right? There's a wobble around the recession in 2001 and 2002. There's another wobble in the recession in 2009. But revenues seem to be doing pretty well when it comes to movie tickets. Now, these are theater movie tickets, right? These are not television and other things. We'll talk about that in a minute. It is worth noting that some fewer people, not a lot fewer people, but some fewer people are going to the movies than did just a few years ago, though it's still more than did in 1995, right? And the reason that the revenue's increasing, even though the ticket sales are declining somewhat, is that tickets are more expensive. People are paying for 3D movies, people are paying for IMAX movies, and one might reasonably expect that when you raise the price in a market, you get more revenue, but the number of people who buy actually goes down somewhat. Each individual person is paying more money. Some people drop out of that market as the ticket price goes up. So this, I think, is a very encouraging sign. The fact that people can and do steal movies, right, even on the first day of release, make them available over the internet, doesn't seem to prevent people from going to the movies. That's even more true outside the United States. One might think, well, gosh, the piracy rates we know are much larger in places like China, Latin America than they are here, so maybe the real problem is not in the United States but worldwide. That turns out to be not true. In fact, it turns out to be the opposite of true. Revenues are growing even more strongly in global box office than they are in US box office, notwithstanding the existence of piracy. We see something similar in television. Television revenue growth hasn't been as great, but television revenue growth nonetheless looks pretty steady, and it doesn't seem to be affected in any significant way by the internet or by the internet coming into sufficiently strong broadband capacity that people might stream movies and television. We project a continued increase. Some of that revenue is online, although interestingly, surprisingly little of it, right? Most of it still comes in the old-fashioned way. Well, the new old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way was you gave the TV away for free and you got your revenue in advertising, right? The new old-fashioned way is you sell the TV access for a lot of money and you get your revenue from advertising, and that's actually turned out to be a fairly stable, sustainable business model as far as the revenue data show. Books, this is not a complete chart of books. I couldn't find a good one. The thing that's notable here is if you're in the business of running an online bookstore, yeah, the internet looks like a pretty bad deal for you, right? Borders is the one that drops off a cliff circa 2011 and 2012. Even Barnes & Noble doesn't look like it's doing all that well. But Amazon alone makes up for the disappearance of Borders and the difficulties that Barnes & Noble are selling, so that by 2013, we're selling in revenue terms far more books than we were in 2002. We're also producing a lot more books. There are more books written and published every year now by a wide margin than there were 10 or 15 years ago. Again, we've made it very easy for people to get into the publishing business. A lot of people who wrote books were told by existing publishers, no, we're not interested, and went away, now self-publish those books. We might think, well, all right, but maybe they suck, except it turns out that a really surprising percentage, not just of books sold, but of the top 100 best-selling books every year in every genre, turns out to start out as a self-published book, a book that was rejected by the publishers. That number is over 10% in every book category, and in some categories like romance novels, it is over 40%. So that's not 40%, it's 40% of the best-selling 100 books, right? Not just revenues, that's not a 50 Shades of Grey sold a lot of money and here's an exception to the rule. That's a whole bunch of books that publishers said we're not interested in, that the public found out about, bought, and then of course they all then got publishers, right? They then end up turning into to revenue generators. Finally, my personal favorite, computer and video games. Computer and video games are having a field day. They've been kind of doing well, and they've started to do even better. These are computer and video games in a variety of contexts, and one of the things we see that makes me optimistic in this market is the different areas in which, so this is US data, this is global data, the different areas in which games are being played. So if you look at the year-over-year returns, there's a bunch of people who are playing games on their TV or console, but that's not really a growth industry, right? But tablet games going up 27%, personal screen games, phone games, and watch games going up 21% a year, already a $20 billion market. Computer screen games still increasing substantially. And this total market, worldwide, $91 billion, right? That's substantially higher than the revenues from movie box office worldwide, substantially higher than the revenues from book sales worldwide, from music sales worldwide. This is a big market, and it is a market that, for various reasons we can talk about, has, I think, been largely immune to the vicissitudes of the internet. Now, none of this is to say that there isn't a huge amount of piracy going on. None of this is to say that piracy isn't a problem, right? But it is to say that when we wondered 6 years ago about whether the sky's falling on the content industries because of the internet, with a little bit of perspective, I think the answer is no, right? That we're generally speaking muddling through. Depends on the industry you're in. It depends in particular on the business model in the industry you're in. But lots of industries are doing really quite well, despite the presence of the internet, or maybe because of the presence of the internet. And even the other ones are hanging on. And the sky might look a little closer than it did in 2010, but it doesn't look like it's coming down. Thanks.
So, Mark, thank you for that very helpful outline, which I'd sum up as saying the world of content creation and distribution is not dying, but it's changing. And I'd like to get some of our industry representatives to reflect and take a few points you picked out. The first is you said the ability to produce music or books on your own has gotten easier. You didn't mention whether that's true for movies and TV shows. So I guess I'm going to ask the panel two questions. A, does Mark's point about it's easier to create a record yourself or a book yourself and then get picked up by an established distribution channel, Does that seem right to you? And B, as for TV and movie production, are we seeing anything like what Mark has highlighted these other areas in that case? Matt, do you want to start on the movie, TV production? Are we seeing changes in that cost structure?
Well, I think that's a great question because it costs next to nothing to write a hit song or even write a book, I suppose, and it costs next to nothing to produce a hit song. But you could write The Force Awakens, but unless you got $250 million in your pocket, you're not making that movie. And I think generally in video production, the actual process of making content is not very different than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. It takes a whole collection of people, talented writers, talented directors, talented actors, set design. It's an enormous undertaking to make video content. Now, there have been people who have made user-generated content, call it the YouTube or the PewDiePie phenomenon. And that's very, very popular, but it's a very, very small percentage of video content consumption. And actual video content of consumption of professional content is actually higher now than it was 10 years ago. So I just think that until someone figures out a way to make a Star Wars movie on your PC without actors, directors, et cetera, there's always going to be that economic aspect.
Lauren, do you want anything adding to that? Or?
The only thing I would say is that technology has driven wider access to information about what people are watching. So you see some of the innovators like Amazon and Netflix moving into original content and having immediate success. And they have access to use, and HBO is a good example, they have access to seeing a lot of information about what people like and why they watch, and then being more efficient in creating new content that people want to watch.
So this is an interesting point. Netflix, it is said, has been a boon for documentary filmmakers. Some people call this the long tail because they provide a good market for purchasers who otherwise would have been harder to reach. So that may not change the cost structure, but it might help make it more marketable to reach an audience. Mark,
I want to just sort of talk a little bit about kind of what do we mean by a movie, right? So as to the Force Awakens and as to kind of classic Hollywood cinema, I think Matt's absolutely right. It's expensive. It has remained expensive. The expense has changed in various. I mean, and there are ways in which kind of CGI and digital effects substitute for old costs, but they also encourage new costs, right? But I do want to quibble with the idea that user-generated content and stuff on YouTube is a sort of small percentage of video consumption, right? So the answer to Phil's question, depending on what you call video content, is there is more video content produced in this country by 5 or 6 orders of magnitude than there ever was before the internet. Most of it is, I shoot home video, right? I produce a little 5-minute thing on YouTube. And you might say, who cares, right? But the answer is a heck of a lot of people care, right? 4 billion videos are watched on YouTube every day. 4 billion. That's a lot of people consuming a lot of UGC.
What's the average time? 5 minutes?
Probably right. So what I can tell you is 4 billion views a day. How many? 6 billion hours of video watched per month. So if we do the math on that, right? So 30 days in a month. So yeah, that's probably right. They're short videos.
Call that a new? I mean, this is an interesting point. Is that different in kind or degree? Because a 5-minute YouTube video versus a 30-minute show versus a 2-hour movie.
Absolutely.
Feel like it might be different in kind.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things notable about this, right, is I don't think it sort of will or should substitute for the sort of classic movie in theaters, right? And probably not for the kind of serial television, although that gets a little closer, right? But what we do see is more people consuming more video than ever before, more people producing more video than ever before, and a pretty fundamental shift in what kinds of video they are watching. And I think those things are complementary. It doesn't mean we can say, let's all have UGC and therefore Hollywood can go away, right? But I do think it's worth recognizing that one of the effects of the internet on the video industry has been to open up this enormous area.
I think that there's a ton of the content that's on YouTube is professional content, is clips that NBC publishes a ton, a lot of it's music video. I do think it's complementary. I don't think that user-generated content is probably a threat to the television business.
I'm going to
At
come
least
back.
I don't perceive
Yeah, no,
it that way.
I want to come back to this in a minute, but I want to give Lynn a chance. Do Mark's data points on the publishing industry and his conjecture that it's easier to publish a book by yourself today and get picked up ring true from your experience?
Well, from my personal experience, yes. From my professional experience, it's very different because it's true. People self-publish, and it's very easy, and I know people who do that. I don't know any of those people who have gotten picked up by the major publishers. But I do scholarly books, so it's a very different world. People have been sharing scholarship since before the internet. It just meant photocopy machines and putting stuff in the mail and sending it to the 12 or 15 colleagues that are doing the work that you're doing. Now people upload it, it's an attachment, click a button, and it goes out to a lot of people. That's having a very negative impact on us, because if people can get it for free, why should they buy it? And I do want to come back to that later, because there's an economic problem where people want what publishers do, but they think it should be free. And we're constantly reminded that people want what we do, but they don't want to pay for it. The Amazon, the graph that you did showing Amazon sales going up. When I'm not hooked up to a mic, I have some things I'd like to say about Amazon. They are now they're sort of tied for our biggest customer, along with a library supplier called Baker & Taylor. The problem is that Amazon selling more units doesn't mean that the producers of what's being sold, whether it be the author or the publisher, and now I'm not just talking about our kinds of books, but in general, that doesn't mean that they are also earning more. In fact, they, for the most part, are earning less, because with the consolidation of distribution mechanisms, Amazon has the clout, unless you're very stubborn, to demand huge discounts. So the net proceeds that go to the publisher, and then in turn the royalties, which are based on those proceeds that go to the authors, are typically not going up.
So Mark, this is a topic I believe that came up in that conversation with Preston, which is what are the dynamics around what economists would call rents, and if rents are being squeezed, whether it's publishers are getting paid less, record companies are paid less, or maybe if we get to, we'll talk about video if that happens there. Do you see impacts on quality, or are there concerns that maybe we've yet to kind of surface?
I mean, I think one question is, where's the money traditionally go and why, right? And I think this has to do with some of the disruption stories, right? So traditionally, artists got paid in the record industry got paid somewhere between 10 and 20% of the gross. The record company took the vast majority of it, and the record company in return for that was doing a whole bunch of stuff, right? They were not only finding the artist, right? They were actually doing all the recording. They're pressing the records. They're making the copies. They own the trucks. They're shipping them out to the stores. They're doing the distribution.
And advertising.
And advertising, right. And one of the things that happens with the internet is a lot of that physical expense goes away, but the record companies, we like making 80%, right? We want to continue to make 80%. So the question is, are we doing 80% of the work? And if not, should we still be making 80% of the profit? So I would distinguish between something like Hollywood, right, where these people are in fact, the cost work expense to generate this thing is really quite substantial, and they've got to recoup that cost. I'll tell you my experience in academic publishing as an author, right, which is I write a law school case book, which is relatively successful, and for which the publisher now charges $220 a book. And of that, the authors see, I think, $20.
What about Amazon?
This year, we pulled our book from the publisher because it turns out that 21 years ago, when we signed the contract, we kept the copyright. Lucky us. We're going to self-publish it on Amazon. For an online, we'll go for $20. And if you want a print-on-demand version, it'll be $40. And the authors will get just about as much out of that transaction as we did before. I know. And so the question is sort of, our publisher in our case wasn't bringing 80 or 90% of the value. So the question is there, can we find a way for either the prices to go down and the publishers and the authors to share the value, or the publishers to sort of be in a situation where they can say, here's why I'm bringing enough of that value?
Here's the problem. The world is not going to work in a one-size-fits-all model, business model. I'm the last one that wants to defend, I don't know who your publisher is, but these big multinational publishers that charge $200 for a textbook. The problem is, and I don't want to make this personal, but there are lots of publishers like us, university presses are a good example, who account for a lot of what's being published out there. So we have a 500-page introduction to international organizations. It's $35. It's a paperback. That's more typical than the things you're talking about. And in fact, what the publisher pays for that is more than it costs more than 80% of what that is. And you don't know, I mean, you can take this book onto Amazon because you have a ready-made audience for that book, which would not have existed if you had started out doing that to begin with. There are people all over the country who are using that book in courses. But I don't want to get into, my particular chip on my shoulder. You mentioned quality. And I think that across our industries, that's something that we should be talking about, is what happens when there is no, of one kind or another, vetting process. And it is true that there are books that find publishers. I sometimes read romance books on airplanes, and they never should have been published. Every sentence, there is every sentence. The heroine did this intuitively, and then in the next sentence, she did it intuitively again. Clearly no editor ever touched that stuff. So, there is a quality issue, whether we're talking about movies or TV or trade books or scholarly books, that I think is an important part of what the creative industries are responsible for.
Right. So my story, everyone has a story here probably from the record industry, was buying the album by Chris de Burgh because I liked the song Don't Pay the Ferryman. The rest of the album was complete and utter garbage. It was unlistenable. And many people had that experience buying music. And part of the problem is somewhere we went from the Beatles' White Album to Chris de Burgh. And that meant you no longer needed to buy the whole album to have the experience of listening to an album. And unfortunately, in that case, the value proposition of selling albums had been diminished by the industry itself, driving to an unbundled world. And anyone who's providing bundled content, one of the challenges is the bundled content valuable and do consumers want it? Let me stick with that, again, go back to video and this YouTube idea. There are some interesting questions about unbundled, non-vertically integrated content, folks. So I'll mention two. Jerry Seinfeld, comedian in Cars Getting Coffee, and Zach Galifianakis's Between Two Ferns. And I guess just to pick back up on Mark, is there anything between the Mentos and Coke or a cat on YouTube, and the other end is Game of Thrones? Are there some intermediate programs that are being developed natively on the internet that are still in the same, what antitrust lawyers would call, market as well-produced TV programs?
Oh, I think it's definitely a spectrum. I don't think it's just black and white. I think you've got a lot of talented people. Some of the examples that you had are Glenn Beck in the news space, right? He went into an over-the-top model. So I think what you're seeing in the video marketplace is there is a fragmentation occurring. You've got Netflix and Amazon. You've got a lot more providers of video content. They're coming at it differently with different kinds of products. Some of it licensed from the big studios. Sometimes they're buying their own content to put it on there. So I do think there's a lot of those fragmentation stresses, or however you want to describe it, that are happening in the video space. I think advertising is under assault a little bit because people have opportunities now to watch content without watching advertising, which is probably, roughly speaking, 60% of the pay for this stuff. I think going back to what we said earlier, it's very interesting with respect to, call it professional content, whether it's a movie or whether it's a TV show. Unless something happens fundamentally and I think this is what you're saying, in the kind of production stream of that, which dramatically reduces the price, which some of that could happen. Reality TV is much less expensive to produce. But every time, let's say, inside of NBC, if we look at a TV show, you have a, quote, green light decision, and it's extremely simple. The show costs X amount per episode, and it's going to generate Y amount of revenue, and if Y is not more than X, the show does not get made. And so that show never shows up anywhere.
So I want to highlight kind of two other ways. I agree entirely with Matt. I want to highlight two other ways in which sort of I think this is happening, and then actually we should hear from Lauren since she's actually doing television too, right? So one is I do feel like there's, it's not just cat videos, right? There's a kind of lower end, non-professional, but still extraordinarily good universe that's made available because you can make low production value but still high quality video, right? So there's an award-winning movie being generated on Love's Labor's Lost, funded through a Kickstarter campaign by some college students. Right? And I don't think there's any chance you could have gotten away with that just in terms of producing it 30 or 40 years ago. Now you can produce it. Now you can find people who are interested in it. And one of the things you can do if you do that, right, I think is get the attention of the more mainstream media folks. And so we raised earlier the issue of intermediation, right? Lynn said, well, how do I know, there's a bunch of garbage out there, right? How do we find the good stuff? The traditional answer to that question has been we have professionals and they know what the good stuff is and they read it and they pick it. And that's still going to be an answer, but it's not going to be the only answer because crowdsourcing, I think, actually will bring things to your attention that you wouldn't previously have seen. The other piece I want to emphasize, which maybe sort of comes sort of downstream from the professional side, we're in the golden age of television precisely because there is a much wider array of stuff being produced than ever before because we've got more channels, because we can reach niche markets, right? You can make a show that's perfectly targeted to me, right? Not, well, I got to do a show. We only got 3 networks, and so we've only got a show that's got to sort of reach kind of some minimum lowest common denominator, right? The show that's perfectly targeted to me may not interest you at all, but both of those shows can coexist. I think that's another form of the kind of middle too, right? Because what we're saying is there's a lot of different opportunities for people to reach the customers, and if you reach instead of reaching kind of 10 million customers with your show every year with a sort of hit show, right? If I reach 1 million customers who really love it and care passionately about it and are going to follow it, right? There's money to be made there too, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Matt, you said this before about some of your shows that are really popular on Netflix might not have been the most popular shows at the time. Yes. So they find these passionate audiences, and there are a few examples of these old shows that find this passionate audience on Netflix that they make more of, right? Wasn't there a couple examples where they...
Well, sure. The usage of The Office on Netflix is now vastly higher than the usage or consumption of The Office when it was on television, when it was on NBC. And there are all kinds of examples like that. And I do think all of these new technologies, it's actually, it's terrific for the customer. They get way more satisfaction now than they did 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. A lot more outlets. They can watch just about any TV shows out there somewhere on one of these services, and that didn't exist a long time ago. It's sort of fragmenting the experience, but I do think one point that I come away with when you look at this, your presentation, is there's ups and downs, some big ups. We see that in our business. It's always changing. It's always shifting. All the markets are always shifting. I'm very optimistic about the future of the television business. It is going to change. International is going to be up, and domestic maybe, plateau or down or up, or but there's going to be plenty of ups. There's going to be some downs, but plenty of ups.
So, Lauren, I want to get to you as a distributor. How are you developing a platform that will meet customers where they are? Because there does seem to be an opportunity there, as you said earlier. How is Layer 3 TV going to go about doing that?
I think that what's important today is to take a step back and say, what do people want to watch, when and where, and how does that benefit all of your partners, right? So Matt just pointed out that a lot of NBC's content is watched on Netflix, and we all know that people spend a lot of time on Netflix. Why does that have to be a separate experience away from the home television? how do we get everything in a place where people want it with the ease and access and efficiency that people are getting used to today, and bring something that's not that different from what people want, but makes an experience that they're looking for without going to 8 different sources.
So I want to pick up on a point that Mark and Matt have both touched on, and I'll start, Lauren, with you on this. Advertising is something that could be getting stripped out of the equation, whether it's DVRs, people wanting to watch on demand, watch things unbundled from maybe some broader lineup. To what extent is that, which Matt cited as 60% of the revenue picture, under assault? Because if you look at the newspaper story that Mark said, it's actually even worse than what Mark said. Mark had total subscription, but the problem is also that even for people who subscribe to newspapers today, the value per customer of, say, classified ads isn't what it was 15 years ago. And so the challenge for TV is twofold. One is to keep the sort of broad subscriber base who watch TV, and second is to get them to keep getting ads. Any thoughts on that challenge?
I love advertising.
You personally like watching ads, you're saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No. Advertising revenues are a base to subsidize content, to make better content. Part of the reason, that Mac's company has money to build professional content that everybody wants to pay to watch is because there's a high margin in advertising. Most people don't realize, but the historic model of selling advertising built on Nielsen ratings is extremely inaccurate. And what that does is it makes it much harder for Matt to monetize the value of all the people watching his channels because there isn't actually an accurate read. And so what technology is doing slowly is creating a space where what's viewed the most can actually be monetized at the highest levels, and the people who are advertising within the content or around the content can more efficiently place advertising. So video on demand is a great example. Syndication without ads is an example of monetizing video on demand. Advertising in video on demand closer within the time frame that it's aired sometimes has different allocation of advertising because they're using newer technologies to bring in higher dollars per ad space. All of this really just helps the consumer get to the content they want to watch, but also supports the creators in monetizing the content the consumer wants to watch.
I think that's actually a great point. The advertising market actually is fairly strong right now for a lot of reasons. But I think that the model of 22 minutes an hour, which still has a lot of life left in it, it was obviously based on a certain technological paradigm. And these new technologies are going to bring forth new opportunities in advertising, targeting, all kinds of opportunities. And I don't know what the ad model of the future is going to look like. It's probably going to be different, just like it's different now than it was 30 years ago. So I do think it seems hard for me to believe that marketplace, the advertising marketplace, is going to somehow disappear. There's always a commercial opportunity there. Smart people will figure it out, and there'll be a way. I mean, look what happened on the internet. An entire advertising industry developed around the internet in all kinds of ways that nobody could have predicted 20 years ago. And I think the same thing will happen in TV.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I think that it is affecting a particular segment, and that's the scholarly journals. Again, these things may be peripheral to what you're interested in, but scholarly journals are a huge industry.
Not at this part of the table, we still care.
Huge part of the print industry. Print/online, because something like 90% of journals are available now in both. So if you subscribe to the journal, you get print unless you opt out, and you get online. So we are not a seller of advertising, but a purchaser of advertising for our book. So we do a book on Africa. We will do an ad in the Journal of Modern African Studies. But when some of those journals have become online only, we no longer advertise in those journals. And we're small, it's not having that big of an impact. But if you publish medical journals where you have huge revenue streams from pharmaceutical companies, medical instrument makers, that sort of thing. When somebody reads an online journal, they're not turning the pages, you know, and kind of just seeing the ads in between. They're going to the article they want to read.
So is that why you don't do it? I was going to ask, because I mean, I can imagine sort of greater opportunities for targeting. Oh, this is a person who's reading an article on this issue.
We may rent the mailing list of the subscribers and then send them direct mail, and we clean our list every year so we know that we're only sending to people that we want, who want our material. And we do email advertising, but only if you opt in. But yeah, no, we're not going to subscribe because someone's going to go to the article about Namibia. They're not going to, it's not like if you're reading Vanity Fair, you know, and you're kind of, you want that in print and you flip through all the pages. So it's really hurting the revenue stream for that kind of publisher.
So a couple of thoughts on sort of the advertising in the television industry, in particular in historical context, right? So first to remember is advertising was a substitute for getting paid for access to the television, right? It was done at a time when television was broadcast over the air for free and no one could collect for doing that, or at least we didn't collect for doing that. Right? More than 90% of television viewing now doesn't fit that model, right? People are paying for their cable subscription, they're paying for their internet access, they're paying for their satellite access, and they're also watching ads, right? So this has been a kind of extra layer of revenue. Despite the presence of DVRs and ad skipping, it is remarkable to me how many people don't skip ads. The majority of people who watch television do not skip ads ever. And that's so. This is I litigated one of these cases on a side you guys probably wouldn't like, the dish hopper. But one of the things that was remarkable is, right, it wasn't. I'm sure that skipping commercials cuts into advertising revenues, but it cuts in less than you would think because people still watch the ads. Now that might be because they don't know any better. They've never figured out how to program their DVR. They don't have a DVR and they are watching live. But I think it's also the case that ads are better than they used to be, right? That, there are a bunch of ads out there that people go affirmatively online to watch because they've captured people's attention.
Super Bowl ads.
Yeah, exactly. That was never true 30 years ago, right? I think you're seeing kind of, as Matt says, other alternatives, right? You're seeing sponsorship arrangements, right? So rather than we'll run a bunch of little 30-second ads, one company will sponsor all or most of a particular program. You definitely see product placement into movies and television. And I do think you see kind of targeting of ads, particularly on the YouTube clips, right? So one of the things you can do in computer is, okay, we're going to run ads that are actually keyed off of what you're paying attention to or what we know about you on your account, better than we sort of have done in television, right? It's always been very coarse. The final point to note about this, by the way, is a really kind of interesting inversion. So a lot of the worry in the television industry is around cord cutting. I'm not going to subscribe to cable. I'm going to get my TV online, and that'll be fine. It turns out that a lot of the opportunities to get TV online feed you ads, fewer than in normal television, but they feed you ads you can't skip. And so in a curious way, the people who are skipping ads, right, are not the people who are skipping cable. The people who are skipping cable are, assuming they're not just pirating everything, right, actually watching more ads. So they're paying in that way, too.
So that gets to my final question. I want to get the audience involved. One of the concerns that you have adverted to, Mark, we haven't gone deep on, is to what extent people, through either piracy or sharing codes for HBO Now or Netflix, are getting used to content being for free, and to what extent is that developing expectations and habits among users that they don't pay for things where they used to have an expectation or habit of paying for things? How real is that concern? Lynn, you've already adverted to it. Maybe I'll let you start off on it.
Well, when Mark was talking about whether the sky was falling, I have to say that I sometimes do feel that it is. Because, and I think we're to some extent to blame for this, because when all of this was new, we sort of were trying things and, putting things, the New York Times did this for a while, putting things out there for free. And we've kind of created an environment where people expect things for free. And they can get them, whether it's the best thing doesn't necessarily matter. They can get them. And a perfect example for me is a recent series of internet exchanges between my marketing manager and a professor who got an examination copy of a book on understanding the contemporary Middle East. And it's a textbook, and it's $27.50, and it's about 500 pages, and it's 4th edition. The first 2 did quite well. How did you like the exam copy? Love this book. It's exactly the way I teach my class. But I'm not going to use it because my university says I should get free things on the internet because books are too expensive. So Sally writes back and says, well, you know, this book is only $27.50. And the professor writes, oh, we love you guys. Your prices are terrific. We love you guys. But I'm not using the book because my university says that we're supposed to use free things on the internet. Well, this is happening more and more. And I mean, we're still in business and we know we're still okay, but I seriously don't know how we will continue if people are saying, you're publishing what we want, you're pricing it the way we want it, but we will compromise and get something that costs less and cobble it together because it's all free. I don't know. What am I supposed to do?
So, Matt, let me start with you on this question. How does NBC, which did not rush into this the way publishing and newspapers has to put content on the internet for free, how do you decide, I'll put something on YouTube for free, I'll put this on Netflix as part of the Netflix account, we'll keep it for on demand, we'll put out DVDs. This is an incredibly complex series of calculations to get content in the right version to monetize it effectively. How do you go about deciding that?
Well, frankly, it's very difficult. I think every media company really struggles with exactly how they parse that out. You know, what is the impact, if any, of Netflix on some of the core businesses, you know, some of the core network businesses? How does it affect the, you know, the studio revenue? The fact of the matter is you just have to make a judgment on what's the best, you know, with the amount of information you have now. A lot of it's what the industry is doing. We do put a lot of content out on YouTube and other outlets, NBC.com, for quote free. It is advertiser supported. And we haven't really seen that it's affected, you know, the core businesses materially. I think that could change over time. And, you know, the good news, frankly, is that customers love our product. They love our sports product. They love our scripted content. There's a ton of consumption. This is not a story of disintermediation where, you know, say it's like film and digital where customers are essentially moving away from your technology to another technology. They still absolutely love the content. The fact that it's available more places is an opportunity as much as it's a threat because people love video and they love this content. So it's really about, over time, figuring out the best balance of all of those windows. But it'll find the right water level over time. It's not something to be fearful. You have to make choices and decisions and then adjust over time depending how the business develops.
And it is remarkable how often in various circumstances people will pay for things that they could get for free. And not always, right? And not always what they were paying when it wasn't available for free. But I do think there are various ways in which something like those sort of free releases onto YouTube, right, or things that allow people then to participate and communicate in social media.
It's promotional.
Right, exactly. Either intentionally or sometimes unintentionally promotional, right? But the fact that people are talking about a show on social media, that they're sharing clips of it, right, ends up redounding in useful but complex ways to the benefit of the copyright owner in many circumstances.
I do think there is one, and I think so much of this redounds to the benefit of the customer. You know, you could look at what's happening in the music industry, and it is a fairly dramatic picture of revenue decline. But I think the average consumer is quite delighted with the music industry now versus the music industry 20 years ago.
Consumers, I think, in all of these industries are better off, and they're better off, but they're better off only.
Necessarily better
Paper
off.
one, though, Mark, that one is actually one where there was a particular economic model. It only existed about 30 years, but having classified ads subsidize investigative journalism in print, there was a value that has been lost.
So I agree with that, although it's also worth noting that right there's more and better for some types of investigative journalism. There's more and better investigative journalism through the crowd than we ever had before, right?
But it's
you're
hard
much
still to
more
fill
like
the noise.
So
It's
that's right.
seamless.
That's right. But you're also much more likely to catch the cop who shoots somebody in the back, right, than you ever would have been, no matter how many reporters the New York Times
Capturing
hires.
things on iPhones and putting them online, that is a hugely valuable thing we didn't have 30 years ago.
That's
Yeah.
not investigative journalism.
No,
that's what
I
you
say it's a
said.
different thing. And I think the one thing I kind of sort of like the final thing to note here is I think in all of these industries, I think Matt's right, consumers benefit. But it's not always sort of black and white because the nature of every one of these industries changes, right? And it may be that we've got 3 times as much music as we ever did before and we get it cheaper and that's great. But we lose something when we don't have somebody whose profession is I make albums and travel around playing them, right? And the music changes, some for better, some for worse. And I think that's true of books, right?
Or
And
the
of
publisher
everything
that
else too.
publishes the book that sells 2,000, the trade book, the novel that sells 2,000 copies that they lose money on, but it's supported by the other books that they publish and, gets people out there. I mean, these things are symbiotic.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off of what Mark said, if you're not the creator, it's imperative, if you're a distributor, to understand what's important to your partners, right? And we originally started talking about security, and with increased access and using internet, security models change, they improve, they cost more, but they're important to the partners. And so, if you're building a new business and you can't empathize with the creators or the groups building channels that represent the creative folks, then you're going to have a difficult time building a business that's symbiotic with your partners. So I think, as a new business, that's something that's been really great, is that we have a lot of veterans that understand the importance of security, the apprehension around piracy that doesn't help any of us. And so I think that's key and important to any new company that's a distributor that's working with content.
Let's go to the audience, and starting with our tradition here, Silicon Flatiron's a student. I'm not afraid to call on people.
There you go.
Yep, okay, go ahead.
Microphone.
You mentioned that there's a lot more content coming out. Have you done any research on what kinds of content are increasing? Like, for example, if I'm going to pay $15 for a movie ticket, I want there to be explosions and surround sound, and so I tend to go to these comic book movies more so than, those dramas that I would have paid $10 for. And the same thing can be said for music. It's a lot cheaper to pay a one-man band for a record than a 5-guy boy band to produce a bunch of records. Have you ever looked at the data for?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, and it goes, I think, to this last point about how it's changing. All of these things just inherently change the nature of creativity, and maybe that's a nice lead into the next panel, right? In some respects, I think. I like the point about the sort of movies. I'm with you too, right? The movies that I am likely to go to now are the big blockbuster ones, the ones you want to see on the big screen rather than at home, more than was true 10 years ago. I do feel, so there have been efforts, the closest I can get is there have been efforts to try to do estimates of quality changes. This is, of course, a notoriously fraught thing, right? Everybody knows that the best music of all time is made in whenever they were between 13 and 20 years old, right? And it's indisputable, right? And so there's a real difficulty of comparability across these things. But the estimates on music, at least, suggest that sort of when you try various ways to get people to sort of rate or estimate the quality, that the quality hasn't actually declined. That doesn't mean it hasn't changed the character of it, right? And that that we might get sort of different types of music than we did when we were sort of all doing albums, for instance.
Can I add one thing to that? I think taking the movie example, what's very interesting in that business, it is so much driven by international now that if you're going to make a big blockbuster movie, it better sell worldwide. And that really affects the kind of movies that end up getting made, and it's also why a lot of the type of movies you're describing get made, because they play well. Fast and Furious did, I don't remember the number, 1.6 billion, I think. And the majority of that was all internationally driven. Now, if you have some movie, a Woody Allen type movie, let's say, that is not going to play internationally at all, now it costs a lot less to make that movie, but no one is going to expect that to be a huge blockbuster hit internationally. And so
Other than France, where they love him for
yeah,
whatever
that's a
reason.
fair comment. Maybe that was a bad example.
No, it's a good example, other than France, where they love Woody Allen for whatever reason. Other questions? Yep.
Hi, I'm also a patent lawyer, but I volunteered for the Navy League to present to Congress. We need more submarines, and lo and behold, a nuclear submarine captain and I wrote a novel called Russian Decepticon, and we have a 90-second trailer on YouTube where Putin hides a nuclear submarine for 6 years off the Fort Lauderdale coast in a giant freighter, and then pops a nuclear bomb when we start to invade the Crimea situation, and it accidentally explodes and blows up a yacht off Miami. One of the famous producers. So nonetheless, we have a 100-page softcover. We have a YouTuber out there. We don't know how to do this. How the heck do you guys suggest you get the content? Let's say it's a student here, with a new way to study upside down at a bar. How do you really get out there? I have a daughter as a freshman here, by the way. And so the question is, are literary agents real things? You get out there, you didn't bring up the word literary agent in all this
Mark,
hour.
you did note that there's some high percentage of self-published works that find their way into the mainstream. How does that happen?
How does that happen, sir?
Yeah, I mean, first to answer your direct question, literary agents are real things, and they are worthwhile for, we don't work with literary agents because we publish academic, scholarly books, but yes, they earn their living by placing your book with publishers. The trick is you need to find literary agents that work in the genre in which you are publishing, and you can find that, okay? But going to self-publishing, it's because agents and good editors, but especially agents, they pay attention to this stuff because, again, they only earn a living when they publish books, or if they're agents, they only earn a living when they find books to sell to publishers. So they troll the internet. They look at the reviews that people pay to have in Publishers Weekly of self-published books, and social media, looking for books that have been self-published, contact the authors and say, let's talk.
Yeah, and I do feel like kind of social media and buzz is a big part of it as well, right? That if a bunch of people start pointing to your YouTube video or talking about your book, right, that gets the attention of other people, that gets some sales, and
Absolutely.
that gets attention.
They follow tweets and all these kind of things.
But I think like anything else, I mean, you said you're a patent attorney, right? You've got a bit of the same. Right, I have an invention. How do I get it to a company? Right, there is this chicken and egg problem. There's no question.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, Sean.
So my question's about social media, which we didn't really talk about at all until the last couple seconds. In the last few years, especially in the TV industry, we've seen a rise in like second screen viewing and event watching, such as like the Academy Awards or the Super Bowl. How do you see that model changing and affecting things like advertising, where it's not just enough to have standard advertising, but also to be working across platforms, and your viewers are not only just watching NBC during the Olympics, but they're also live tweeting the event. So I'm curious how that you see social media affecting traditional media.
So that's a great question. We actually didn't talk too much about it, but it's obviously a huge influence really in all parts of life, and growing influence in TV, and people really love to talk about and connect with it, particularly around big events like you're describing. So we have teams of people that really look at how to activate social media. Really we look at it more as promotional effort, I suppose, right now, more than strictly a consumption platform, because they're really not built as a consumption platform in the way in which we monetize most of this TV content right now. Though that's changing. You know, we've got a lot of content, say around Jimmy Fallon, for instance. I forget the statistic on YouTube, but Jimmy Fallon is in the billions in terms of views every year on YouTube. So there's key NBC franchises where there's enormous consumption online and increasingly on social, and there'll be money coming in from that too. You know, we'll have advertising against it. So I think it's gonna increasingly be a consumption model. I don't know where the future goes. You know, the NFL just did a deal for Thursday Night Football, and they're going to do a deal with an online provider there. So there's going to be some online provider that steps into that. So, you know, you'll see.
I think there's something important here that's beyond just consumption, though, right? People want to interact, right? It's the reason they go to cons. It's the reason they sort of, you know, get posters of their favorite movies and put them on the wall. They want to have a continued experience with the movie they love. They want to have a continued experience with the book. And one of the things that the internet allows you to do is actually have real interactivity, sometimes in the quite real sense, right? This is why I think video games are such a huge number, right? That's a way for me to experience content that's not just me watching it, it's me part of it. But I think part of what's going on with the second screen and social media is precisely that desire for interactivity. I want to be part of the conversation. I'd like to be part of the show, but I'm not going to get on the show. The least I can do is sort of be part of the conversation, the meta world around the show. And I think tapping into that actually is really tapping into something fundamental in human nature that the internet has made possible, and that I think the content folks can and should be taking more advantage of.
In a nice meta move, I hope there's some good Twitter discussion about this topic as we speak. Lauren, do you see, though, it becoming maybe one screen? Could a distribution platform in the future actually bring the social media chatter, call it, into the same platform as the show people are watching, or are these going to remain separate screens?
And of course, there's that possibility, I would say. The question is, what is the interactive experience the consumer really wants? Is it, and I think of social media as modern digital word of mouth that has, you know, a component of advertising to the extent you're using it for promotion. But, you know, when I'm watching TV, do I want social media to be there with me because I want to be part of the conversation or watching the conversation? So do I want to be actively engaged while I'm watching Game of Thrones, or do I want to know what people are saying about Game of Thrones? And it's different for everyone, so I think you kind of have to evaluate what your constituency wants on the screen that you're using.
For those who get the reference, kind of like being part of Mystery Science Fiction 3000 yourself or not. We have time for one more question. Another question in the audience? Yes, in the back.
Thank you. My question is maybe a bit vague. It's about the buzzword sharing economy and figureheads like Amanda Palmer. I don't know if you saw the TED Talk. She's a pretty famous musician who doesn't charge for her content, doesn't charge for her concerts. She just asks for her viewership to share what they feel is right. And then, you know, turning viewers into stakeholders with venues, platforms like Kickstarter for independent film, for example. Do you see these like shifts in value where consumers give of their own volition, not because they're required to? Do you see that as sort of a drop in the bucket in the landscape of content creation, and or is that something that maybe will have a stronger influence in the future?
So to me, it's more than a drop in the bucket, right? I don't think we're going to kickstart the next Star Wars movie, right? But you know, it's not crazy. So they did kickstart Veronica Mars movie, right? They raised $2 million in a matter of a week or so, and it caused a big, you know, major production movie to happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened. You see a lot of that, I think, at the kind of sort of more, you know, smaller level. I mentioned this Love Labor's Lost movie, right, which is being generated this way. So I think and I think it goes a little bit to my answer to the last question, right? Part of it is I do think people will pay for things they love, will pay for things they care about. But I also feel like that makes you a part of the project. It's interactive and it's a part of the experience in a way that just sort of passively consuming it is not.
You're a member.
Yeah.
As part of it. The last thing we didn't, there's so much here we didn't get to talk about, but one industry that's piece of this universe worth watching is podcasting. So people here probably heard about Serial. Some people may have heard of Gimlet Media. They're trying to develop economic models to support what you might call long-form journalism. And it's really interesting. One of the things they're doing is native ads, and they're trying to do members where they give you a T-shirt and access to some shows. It's going to be interesting to see whether that succeeds as another part of the overall ecosystem. For the panel, any final thoughts that you might want to leave, either things we covered that are worth underscoring or we didn't get to touch on that are worth coming back to next time? Lauren, I'll let you start off.
I think you're right about the native advertising. And I think it'll be interesting to watch how technology increases access to content, efficiency, and changes the model with a different set of expenses and opportunities.
Oh, I wish I could think of something profound. I'm hopeful that value will prevail in the end.
I'm rooting for you, Lynn, on this.
I mean, not just in everything.
Absolutely.
That people, I mean, I'm like anyone else, something's free, it's appealing, but eventually these things do curve down, and there's a resistance after a while when people start to see that the thing that was free maybe isn't worth taking the time to watch or to read, and that there'll be a shift back. The long cycles of politics and sociology have been going on for history, so I'm going to be hopeful, at least today. That the sky won't fall.
Well, I think it's interesting. I've been in the business now since '92, and I think the sky has always been falling. It's always been something, and I don't think that's going to change. And I think it's really the nature, particularly of an economic system like the U.S., that happens. I, for one, am enormously optimistic about the future of television and content in general. I think there's going to be winners and losers. There always have been, and there always will be. And smart companies which make the right bets and have the right portfolio are going to be winners. And I think that there's another, I don't know what to call it, tailwind, I suppose, that's out there, and we touched on it a little bit, which is really international. This country is a premier content creator. And there is just literally billions of people who are new consumers, who are getting richer, who are wanting, this content. There are producers and those companies coming up. So really, all this content, the global output of content is actually quite healthy. And I think I'm very bullish on that continued growth.
So keep an eye on the sky as always, but I don't think we need to duck.
All right, thank you all very much. Great discussion.